All right, hi everyone. So in this video, we're going to go over and start talking about the autonomic nervous system. All right, and so first let's do an overview and kind of review and compare the somatic nervous system to the autonomic nervous system. All right, and so if you remember with the somatic nervous system, we are looking at kind of innervating skeletal muscle. All right. So the somatic nervous system controls skeletal muscle, whereas the autonomic nervous system is going to control smooth and cardiac muscle. All right, as well as glands. All right, smooth and cardiac muscle and glands. Okay, and so then there are a couple of kind of structural differences as well for these two systems. So with the somatic nervous system, it only has one, what we call a lower motor neuron. All right, and so that's just referring to the neuron that is leaving, that our efferent neuron that is leaving the spinal cord to reach the actual muscle. Okay, and so this cell body for this motor neuron is located in the ventral horn. All right, so it has a cell body in the ventral horn, and then there's only one, so that means from that cell body it'll send out an axon, and that axon will go straight to the skeletal muscle that is controlled by that particular neuron. All right, and so then it's different with the autonomic nervous system because we have two lower motor neurons. All right. So the first one is going to have a cell body that is located in the lateral horn. All right. And so then from there, that axon from that neuron in the lateral horn is going to leave the spinal cord, and it'll synapse with the second lower motor neuron that is located in a ganglion outside of the spinal cord. All right, so the second cell body is in a ganglion. All right, and so we'll talk about those and kind of where those the ganglia are located, and kind of what their names are, because they differ depending on which part of the autonomic nervous system we're talking about. All right, but you do always have two. Okay, so you have your two lower motor neurons, one that leaves the spinal cord, all right, and the one that has a cell body located in a ganglion outside of the spinal cord. All right. Okay. And so that's what this was for, right? Lower motor neuron. All right. Good. Okay, and so let's just kind of talk about the terminology associated, especially we're going to focus on our autonomic nervous system, right? So our two lower motor neurons. All right, so we have two. All right, one located, as I said, in the lateral horn, one in a ganglion. And so we give them names. All right, and you can actually see it diagrammed here, okay, based on their location. So somatic, we have our one lower motor neuron. So this is our somatic, and this is our autonomic nervous system. All right. So we have our one lower motor neuron for somatic. So this would be in that ventral horn, sending its axon out to the skeletal muscle where it will cause it to contract. Here we have our two lower motor neurons. So this would be the ventral horn of the spinal cord. This would be the ganglion. All right. And so the one in the ganglion would send its axon out to whatever its target was, whether it's cardiac, smooth muscle, or glands. Right, and have the appropriate effect on those. Okay, so we call the first of the two lower motor neurons here a pre-ganglionic neuron. All right, so this is pre because it comes before the ganglion. Ganglionic neuron. All right, so this is our first lower motor neuron. All right, and then our second lower motor neuron is going to have its cell body in that ganglion. All right, and it's called a postganglionic. Okay, so our postganglionic neuron. All right, so those are our two neurons, and they're given those names. All right, so you have a preganglionic neuron with the cell body in the spinal cord, and a postganglionic neuron with a cell body in the ganglion. Okay. And so with the autonomic nervous system, it is divided into two different divisions. Okay, and so we have the sympathetic nervous system. All right, and we have the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, and so also just to point out, there is another branch that is associated usually with the autonomic nervous system called the enteric nervous system. Okay, and so you might read that in your textbook or something. And so this enteric nervous system controls digestive function. And it's typically influenced by both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. All right, so if you see that enteric nervous system, that's what it's referring to. But we're going to focus on sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay, and so both of these divisions are going to be regulated by the hypothalamus. Okay, and kind of controlled by the hypothalamus. All right, so let's just go through each. Sympathetic, right? And then in the next video, we'll talk about parasympathetic. Okay? So, sympathetic nervous system. Let's talk about this kind of structurally and look at the anatomy first, and then we could talk about the effects. So for these, you should be familiar with where the cell body for that first lower motor neuron is, all right, where the cell body specifically for that second lower motor neuron is, so where that ganglion is located, and then the neurotransmitters that are involved with these different synapses that we're going to look at. All right, so we'll point those things out. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system typically leaves the spinal cord around T1 through L2. Okay, so it's going to be mostly kind of in the thoracic part of the spinal cord. All right, and the ganglia, most of the ganglia where our second lower motor neuron are located is going to be in this sympathetic trunk, right? And they're called sympathetic ganglia. Okay, and so that is going to be these guys here. Okay, and so one of these, right, like this, would be a sympathetic ganglion, right? And then this whole structure here, that is our sympathetic trunk, right? So all those ganglia are kind of connected to each other, forming that sympathetic trunk. And it sits pretty close to the side of the spinal cord, okay? So for these, right, our first lower motor neuron, right, is located in that lateral horn of the spinal cord, and it is in the T1 through L2 region of the spinal cord. All right, and so this would be from lateral horn. All right, so it goes from the lateral horn, right, out the ventral root to that sympathetic ganglion, right, in the sympathetic trunk. Okay, and so here in that sympathetic ganglion, you can see we have a synapse between our preganglionic neuron, which is dark green, so cell body in the spinal cord, sends its axon out, and that is going to synapse with our postganglionic neuron, which is this light green. Okay, at that synapse, right, the neurotransmitter that is involved is acetylcholine. Okay, so they're called, these first lower motor neurons that release acetylcholine are called cholinergic neurons. All right, so this would be our first lower motor neuron that is a cholinergic neuron. It just means it makes and releases acetylcholine. And so then our postganglionic neuron that is receiving that signal from the acetylcholine is going to contain nicotinic receptors for that acetylcholine. All right, so these are on the second lower motor neuron, the postganglionic neuron. All right, and they allow it to respond to that acetylcholine. Okay, so the neurotransmitter here in this ganglion is acetylcholine. Okay, so then from there, that signal would be sent from that postganglionic neuron to whatever the end organ is that it's going to. All right, and on that end organ, we are going to have, for the sympathetic nervous system, the neurotransmitter, I'll just write it here, norepinephrine or epinephrine, either one, right? So it would be epinephrine, right? They're very similar neurotransmitters. Norepinephrine and epinephrine, also called noradrenaline and adrenaline, right? They just have slightly different receptors, but they produce very similar effects, okay? And they're associated with the sympathetic nervous system, all right? So they're released onto the end organ. So these second lower motor neurons, right, would be called adrenergic neurons because they're releasing adrenaline, adrenergic neurons. All right, good. And then the end organ would have alpha or beta adrenergic receptors. All right, so this is for epinephrine or adrenaline. All right, and that's going to be located on the end organ. All right. Okay. So to review, all right, with the sympathetic nervous system, all right, it starts in the spinal cord, kind of the thoracic region, right? The cell body is located in the lateral horn. This would be a cholinergic neuron, sends its axon out to that sympathetic ganglion where it synapses and releases acetylcholine onto our postganglionic neuron. All right, and so then that postganglionic neuron, also a adrenergic neuron, is going to send its axon out to a end organ, and on that end organ, it will release epinephrine or norepinephrine. All right, that norepinephrine will bind to its beta adrenergic receptors and have its given effect, which we're going to talk about at the end of this chapter. Okay, so that's kind of the general organization of the sympathetic nervous system. There is, you can see kind of on this picture, a little bit of an exception to what we just talked about. All right, so you can see there's this group here of ganglia, all right, and second lower motor neurons that start outside of this sympathetic trunk. Okay, so that's because the majority of the ganglia for the sympathetic nervous system are sympathetic ganglia, and they're part of the sympathetic trunk. However, there are some that are called collateral ganglia. Okay, and so these are outside of that sympathetic trunk. all right? And they're typically going to be located ventral to the spinal cord, and they go to abdominal organs. Okay, so these are collateral ganglia. All right, so that's collateral, all these guys. All right, so outside of that sympathetic trunk, those are collateral ganglia. They're going to be in front of the spinal cord and going to abdominal organs. All right, and the neuron, the preganglionic neuron that goes to these collateral ganglia, they are called splanchnic nerves. All right, so these are preganglionic axons going to collateral ganglia. Okay. All right, and so then one more really interesting topic associated with the sympathetic nervous system is the fact that it sends some nerves, right, some fibers directly to the adrenal medulla, okay? And so you can see that on the picture up here, all right? So it's showing right here, right? So it's showing some nerves, right, going straight from the spinal cord, and this is still dark green, right? So it's not synapsing in any ganglion, and it goes straight to the adrenal medulla and activates it, right? That's unique for the sympathetic nervous system. We won't see that with parasympathetic. Okay, so the preganglionic neuron goes directly to the adrenal medulla, and what it does there is it causes release of epinephrine. Okay, and so this epinephrine released from the adrenal medulla is a hormone, right? Meaning that it travels through the blood. Okay, that's very different from our neurotransmitter kind of release of epinephrine, which is released only onto that target tissue. This epinephrine would be released into the blood, and it would travel through the blood and essentially reach every single organ in the body. All right, and so this is one reason that the effects of the sympathetic nervous system are so widespread. They're very, very widespread, affecting almost every tissue and organ in the body, is because you have this hormone that is traveling out to all those tissues. You don't need a direct transmission of neurotransmitter for these effects, okay? And we typically associate the kind of fight or flight response with the sympathetic nervous system, all right? So then at the end of this chapter, there'll be a chart where we'll go through all the effects on the different kind of organs of both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, because typically they do have impacts on all of the organs. They both do, both branches. And that is called, this will be our last note for this video, right? Dual innervation. Okay, so most organs, all right, that are affected by the sympathetic nervous system can also be affected by the parasympathetic nervous system, all right? And that is dual innervation. Okay, so tissues influenced by sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. All right. Okay, good. So then in the next video, we will pick up and talk about the parasympathetic nervous system, right, and go over its structure and how it's arranged. And then we can go through and talk about the effects of each and how they affect the body. All right, so then that will be in the next video.